I think we can go ahead and get started. So I just wanted to introduce myself first for those of you who don't know who I am. Poso, Nat Tamatamo, Natakam, Wapashi, Nitotam, Kayas Mamachi Toa, Gamat Nomanewik, Gresham and Nitskiwakian. So my English name is Kristen Welch. I'm the founder and executive director of Waking Women Healing Institute. I'm a descendant of the Menominee Nation. And we just wanted to share a little bit of an announcement before we start the actual presentation. So we're excited to be able to share with you that a new public awareness campaign called the Be Safe campaign was launched on October 18th. The Be Safe campaign seeks to enhance awareness of local domestic violence resources and is a joint effort of Golden House, law enforcement organizations, and the community coordinated response team in Brown County. Led by community leaders and organizations, the Be Safe campaign seeks to reach domestic violence victims by offering a free local resource and an easy to remember phone number to call or click when they need help. We invite you to visit 920212safe.com for more information or share the number with the victim needing support. That's 920-212 SAFE for the phone number. It's amazing what happens when we come together to help address social determinants of health. And we thank you for attending this conference. And at the end, we'll ask you to please answer a short survey. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I just wanted to introduce you first to a little bit about who we are at Waking Women Healing Institute, who we serve, and to know that this isn't something that I do completely on my own. We have a full team of helpers and volunteers with us. We are located in Gresham, Wisconsin, and we serve Shawano Menominee County primarily for our direct services. And we serve Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit survivors of violence that includes sexual violence and domestic violence, as well as working with our families of MMIW or MMIP. So we have survivors and family members that make up our team, and they each have a special strength and gift and talent that really helps pull this work together so that we can provide a comprehensive approach with our survivors in creating spaces of both healing and justice for them. So Alyssa Korn, she is our Elise Korn, excuse me. She is our assistant manager, and she's also an MMIW family member. We have Lakeisha Williams. She serves our survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence. Caitlin Welch, she works on digital storytelling so we can really uplift our survivors and families' stories in a healing-centered way. We have Dr. Renee Grailwitz. She works on education and outreach. So she really works in the community, providing presentations on the historical effects of MMIW and the present day and contemporary issues that we face. Paula Mohan is a great ally that we work with, and she works a lot with policy and law that affects issues of women and violence against women. So when we think about the issues of MMIW and MMIP, we have to ask ourselves, like, how did we get to this point? Excuse me. I just want to make sure I can see the chat. And a little extra note, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll try and pay attention as much as I can. If I don't get to them in real time, then we can answer those questions at the end of the presentation as well. But the issue of MMIW and MMIP really is a historical issue. So it goes back, 500 years ago upon first contact. And there's this horrific connection between the violence on land and the violence that is occurring on our bodies as Indigenous women. And settler colonialism is really the root cause of that violence. Even when we're talking about domestic violence and sexual violence, that started with settler colonialism and the removal of Indigenous people from our homelands, and continues today. And it affects not only our communities and our Indigenous women and girls, but it affects the climate and has had devastating effects on our climate. And the forms of colonial and patriarchal violence that we're specifically talking about, there's many different kinds of violence that we experience. The land grabs and resource extraction is one of those issues that contributes to the problems of domestic violence, sexual violence, and MMIW. We know that along areas of resource extraction, there are man camps. So there are these pop-up cities of the workers on the pipelines. And they're oftentimes in rural areas, in tribal territories, which are already really stretched thin for law enforcement and resources for survivors of violence. And in these man camps, we know that there's a lot of human trafficking. There's a lot of drug trafficking as well that's happening. So our Indigenous women, that's where we go missing and murdered. It's not the only place, but we know that those areas of resource extraction increase the violence that we see and that we face. Up to like 74% is one of the latest numbers that we've seen. Another issue is the hypersexualization of Indigenous women, and that's an issue that started back in Contact as well. We know that human trafficking was happening upon contact with very young Indigenous girls. It's logged in Columbus's, work logs and workbooks, and it hasn't really stopped. And the use of sexual violence was actually a war tactic against Indigenous people to sort of break down our community systems and our kinship systems and our governance structures. Indigenous women had this sort of political power in our communities. We had economic power in our communities. We were decision makers, and we were the ones who helped raise and uplift future leaders in our communities. And that was a threat. It was a threat because we were seen as the Indian problem. The settlers wanted the land, and to get rid of us, they had to use these tactics to break it down. So when we're thinking about how did, Indigenous women become objects and, hypersexualized, that's the issue that needs to be talked about when we're looking at domestic violence as well, that it's the dehumanization of us as women in general. I think settler colonialism has done that to all women across the board, but especially Indigenous women. And they infringed upon and took away our rights and tried to strip those rights away as decision holders and makers within our communities. And one of the issues that it's pretty prominent today in politics is Indigenous women's rights to choose over our bodies and our healthcare and access to healthcare. So we had traditional midwifery and doula, and it was, there were issues of accessing them, and we also had choice and decision-making over our bodies. So those were broken down over time. And unfortunately, especially here in Wisconsin, we're seeing those rights infringed upon again against all women. And when they reduced or eliminated our access altogether, because we have been working to reclaim access to land as Indigenous people, but in some of our nations, they were completely removed and completely, they still have no access to the land. What they did was removed us from our pharmacies, from our schools, from our teaching systems, from our shelters and our homes. And when you look at the underlying issues of domestic violence and survivors that we work with, one of the main, ways we can prevent that violence is ensuring we have access to healthcare, we have access to medicines, we have access to behavioral health and to shelter. And it's a gender-based issue. When we look at colonial and patriarchal thinking, there is this huge sort of binary structure that's the norm. So they also attacked our Indigenous norms of gender. We looked at and we're reclaiming that idea that gender is not binary. And there's certainly no inequity between any of our genders, that we walked with each other. And that was required. We had a deep respect for women in our community as life givers, and not just in a physical sense, but we're talking about the ones that are like the glue of the family that hold things together. And we also recognize that our Native LGBTQ and our Two-Spirit relatives were incredibly important in our societies. They help to raise the children who may have been orphaned. They were looked at as spiritual leaders and spiritual beings in our community. So there was that attack on gender, just the way that we honor it and we recognize it's not binary, and that there is no one gender that's less than. In settler colonial thinking, there's definitely a hierarchy, and it's a binary structure, right? So if you're like this white male, because race is also included in that way of thinking, that you're kind of at the top of the hierarchy. So we really need to look at these multitude of issues that lead us up to this bigger problem, and understanding that these acts were historical acts, but they're still very prevalent today, and they've been institutionalized. So we need to really look at institutions and systems like our foster care, like the education system, like medical care, justice, our justice systems, detention, incarceration. We know that a lot of Indigenous women face violence while they're incarcerated, and are often there because they are survivors who fought back, or they're there because of their partners. And then the church. So the church worked in unison with the government to ultimately remove us from our identity. And if you know anything about the boarding school era, we had physical removal of our children, and they were placed in boarding schools in which they worked to assimilate us as Indigenous people. So we were not allowed to speak our language. We were not allowed to have access to land, and we weren't allowed to pass all of that knowledge down to the next generation. And that was both, again, the church and the government worked together. And I don't think people understand, like, that is, while it's historical, it's not all that long ago that these boarding schools existed, and they were in operation until the late 90s across US and Canada. And that system of boarding school is now the modern foster care system. So it's important for us as providers to understand our own bias. Do we have patriarchal and colonial thinking in there? And how can we work to address that so we can prevent future violence against people? Just so you can see some of the rates of violence that we face as Indigenous women, we know that in some areas, the rates in which we go murdered are 10 times higher than the national average. And one of the issues that we face is bias in the media. So there's a few main issues that lead up to us going missing and murdered. Access to media and having our stories presented in the media when we go missing and murdered is one of them. But we also face sort of this really negative narrative, or victim blaming, shaming narrative when our stories are in the media. So we may have a sister or a relative who's gone missing or murdered, and often what's reported is this really negative light about her. You know, she was homeless, she was a sex worker, you know, she was formerly incarcerated, rather than she's this human being who's experienced violence, and it's not put on the perpetrator, really. It's like almost like her fault that she's gone missing and murdered. And again, we see that with our survivors of violence and domestic violence as well, that our communities have sort of picked up this norm of blaming and shaming our survivors. And sometimes inadvertently, we do that with our systems responses. And I think it's, you know, as Indigenous women, that 94% number is more likely 100%. As a survivor myself, as someone who works with survivors, there aren't really too many Indigenous women and young girls that we've come in contact with, or that we know, that have not experienced some sort of sexual violence or physical violence in their lifetime. And that's intergenerational. So you have communities who are not just dealing with that immediate trauma, but my auntie, my grandma, my great grandma have all experienced this horrific violence. This was a quote from one of the families that we work with. So a lot of our work is focused directly on providing these safe spaces for our survivors to heal and to find empowerment through reconnecting to all of those things we just talked about that were removed from us or attempted to be removed. So we depend on reconnecting to our Indigenous matriarchal systems. That's one of our tenets, is restore the matriarchy. We want to reclaim everything that was attempted to be taken from us, from traditional birthing and doula work to our plant medicine knowledge, to our food knowledge, to restoring our teaching lodges in our community, and our rites of passage ceremonies, and how those are protective factors for us, but they also help heal and empower us as a community as well. And it gives us a place to, as survivors and family members, to feel like we're heard and we're seen. And that's one of the biggest unfortunate repeated patterns that we see, is the silencing of the issue of the violence that we face. And that there isn't really a great response many times when we do go missing and murdered, or even prior to that, when we're looking at serving our survivors. There's so many places of intervention where systems have this opportunity to really make connection and build relationship with survivors so they don't go missing and murdered. And even in that systems, we're finding this same pattern. I'm not being heard, I'm not being responded to, and they feel like they're left behind. And we're putting an awful lot on our families of MMIW, that they often have to become lawyers and detectives and media experts so that their stories can be heard and uplifted. And those are just a handful of our relatives that have gone missing from the Menominee Indian Reservation. So we always just want to acknowledge them and their families. So again, what we were talking about is that it's our families and our survivors who often have to do the brunt work when they go missing. Some of the patterns that we see in the cases of missing is that it's a bias in response, usually from law enforcement. That's usually their first contact, is trying to file that report when their relative has gone missing. There's pushback and resistance to actually file that report. And we know in those cases when someone goes missing, it's absolutely critical to have immediate response and a community-led and directed response. So what we've heard from law enforcement when we work with families, we act as liaisons with our families to help them navigate some of these systems. But the responses have been, well, maybe she doesn't want to be found, maybe she's on a binge, or, we've worked with her before, she's gone missing a few times, and we know she probably just doesn't want to be found. I think one of the, most alarming things that we've actually heard, law enforcement say was, well, if she really needed help, she would call for help. And so that's where we really need people to understand bias and the different forms of bias and even racist responses, and how that contributes to, one, re-traumatizing survivors that are seeking help, but could potentially, cause a loss of life. So in those cases, we've had some good responses as well. So I do want to highlight that in working with law enforcement. We've been able to form this multidisciplinary team for our families of MMIW. So we're comprised of family members, advocates who have worked and know the system. We have former no-body homicide detectives and who was formerly working with the Madison Police Department. And we also have access to coroners, because unfortunately that's part of the response as well. But we come together as a team and kind of brainstorm, how can we help this family navigate the system, what should be working, or what should be happening in terms of response, and what isn't happening. And we take a team response in listening to what the family wants us to do, but we also want to create a media presence, especially in cases of our missing relatives. So we create flyers, we create press releases for the family members, and we get it out into the news immediately. And that's when we know that things start moving, is when systems feel that there's a little bit of pressure. Okay, this family has some help. And we also want to work with law enforcement. We don't want to be adversary. We don't want to, work against any of our victims advocates or victim specialists. We're just trying to provide an extra support and communication, because our families are in absolute trauma. And it's really hard to think when you're in that space of complete fear. You don't know where your relative is, you don't know what's happened to them. And especially as Indigenous women, there's this extra added fear when you have relatives go missing, that they're in immediate danger. And oftentimes we don't have a good outcome of them returning home. Now, in cases where we have murdered relatives, the response has been pretty similar in that there's not always that immediate investigation. And when it is, it's not a full response as it should be. Like if we had, I think a good example, sort of like this bias in response, it was a missing case, but there was a young girl in Wisconsin who had gone missing. And, within like 48 hours, they had 20 different jurisdictions working together. It was on the local news and national news, and we tracked it. It was global news within 48 hours. We don't really get that response when we go missing. And we have to really fight hard for basic work to be done. Can you just file the report? And some of that confusion, again, is intentional stripping of tribes' abilities to prosecute crimes, but also there's this jurisdictional confusion. We have state, county, and federal jurisdiction, but I think one of our consultants said it best is like we kind of have to stop using that excuse that we don't know whose jurisdiction it is, because it kind of puts it off. It kind of takes the responsibility off of those ones to respond properly. But call it what it is that people are just not wanting to take on these cases, and that we need to learn how to navigate them. We know it's an issue now, we need to do something about it. When we have our relatives who have gone murdered, oftentimes, like I said, the investigations are not happening. They're not happening in a proper way to collect evidence for our survivors. And our families really are the ones on the ground doing the searches, whether it's missing or murdered, or they're hiring private detectives so that they can ensure that their families get justice. I know in one case that we helped, and we serve, locally direct services, Shawano Menominee County, but nationally for our MMIW cases. And it was a federal case, and it was over almost 2 years this family had to fight for justice. And it was pretty clear, they had the murderer in custody, they had all the evidence they needed, but from the beginning until the end, they weren't really properly communicated about what was happening in their case. They faced a lot of delays, and that's re-traumatizing on the family. I don't know if you can imagine trying to have to prepare for a court case in which you're going to see the person who murdered your daughter, only to show up in like an hour before they tell you, well, this is delayed, we're going to put it off again. And that puts a lot on the families economically. These court cases, especially at the federal level, are not usually close by to where the family lives. So they have to take off work, they have to travel, they have to get there. So I think, when we're talking about bias in our systems and response, we need to really take an internal look at how are we serving survivors? What are our protocols and policies? How are we providing clear and transparent communication, which was one of the biggest asks of families. We just want to know what's happening. Can you ensure us that even if you can't tell us because it's active investigation, what can you tell us? So having that trauma-informed approach is really imperative, I think, for improving responses, not just when we go missing and murdered, but going further upstream to how are we serving our survivors of violence. So that's some of the work that we're doing here at Waking Women, is to sort of restore those matriarchal ways of being in our communities and resisting and pushing back against systems and encouraging them and asking them to do better and holding them accountable when they're actively causing harm to our families. So some of the ways that we've been able to do that, sorry, there's like a little delay on are through direct services, through healing programs, and then providing trainings with our systems partners like law enforcement and those that serve survivors of violence. within our last year and a half of operation, we served 19 families. That number is now 20 of MMIW, MMIP, and that's across the nation. And that was a multidisciplinary team approach in which we focus on the healing needs, the spiritual needs, the emotional needs, the physical needs of our families. And then that's ongoing care. So after, the missing and murdered response or the survivor, has come forward, we don't just sort of like end that care, that this is our relative and we want to make sure that they're taken care of even after that case has ended in the justice systems. So I think for us, ongoing care is just like a natural way of being. Like, you just take care of your relatives, right? They need help. You want to make sure that they're taken care of, but understanding that there's young ones and there's children that are left behind that are now being raised, by aunties or grandparents. So we want to make sure that they have every single tool they need to heal from that loss and that trauma, and to really be connected to who they are as Indigenous people. For our survivors and a lot of our family members, because of the effects of settler colonialism, housing and access to housing is a number one need. We've provided 22 safe shelters. Those are the immediate shelters, the emergency shelters, and in some cases, we've supported active rescues of our survivors. And this is just like what a group of community women, Indigenous women, are doing because we were tired of nothing being done. And a lot of us have worked in the system, and it was frustrating because you're very limited on how you can build relationships with your survivors and your family members, but also how you can serve them, when you can serve them, and where you can serve them. We threw that all out the window in providing unconditional care. If you need help, you're going to receive the help. And those safe shelters have built into really strong relationships. And we've seen these women now starting to thrive. Like, once you can have that safe place, you can stabilize and you can begin to move forward. And we've been able to serve about over 300 plus survivors of violence in our last 2 years of operation. There's a question about how did we start the discussion with law enforcement? A lot of it happens after cases that we've worked together with law enforcement, especially when we've had a really great response. There was a Sergeant Matt Wilson, I believe he's from Brown County, in which we just were really thankful for his response. My niece had gone missing in a completely another state in Florida. And we knew that that was going to be a real challenge, because to work across states and jurisdictions, on the other end, Florida had, sort of jurisdiction over that case. They might not be doing what they need to do. They might not have the resources to do what they need to do. And that was definitely the case at first. But once Sergeant Matt Wilson got involved, he was able to put pressure on them. He had the training in the background, and he credited the training that he had to the way he responds to when women, Indigenous women, but especially, all people, I should say, but especially Indigenous women and those who have experienced trauma go missing. He made sure that they were doing their job. And he said, we unfortunately face a lot of the same issues that you face, that there's not always that quick, immediate response or sort of willingness to file those reports or do those investigations. But with a little bit of nudging and encouragement, which he did, it works. So you have to have real communication. We need training for law enforcement, and we need more Sergeant Matt Wilsons in the world, for sure. But that's how a lot of our conversations start, are cases that we've worked together with law enforcement. We try to communicate as much as we can clearly with them. We let them know we're working with the family, we're an organization who serves survivors and MMIWP, and kind of our role is to be an advocate and liaison with the family throughout the system. We just want to provide information and sort of protect our survivors and families in the process as much as we can too from further trauma. So one of the programs that we offer. It's called We Are Brave, and it's really a land-based and culture-based group for our survivors of many forms of violence, sexual violence and domestic violence, and our families of MMIW. But it's taught, and I don't want to say taught, but the curriculum is the culture for sure. And we pull in different grandmothers, aunties, community members who have knowledge around the things that were stolen from us. So we talk about, traditional birthing and doula work, and how can we raise up more doulas in our community as prevention of violence and healing from it as well. How do we reclaim our Indigenous gender norms? How do we reconnect to the land? Just utilizing spaces where we connect to the water, whether it's kayaking or we're doing, cultural ceremonies by the water. Those are all really important for us to not only heal these wounds of violence, but for us to sort of reclaim this critical thinking, and take a bit of our power back. Land for Wellness over the summer. It's a little chilly now, but we had touring yoga. We want to find spaces where we can come together as community to connect to the land in a lot of different ways. So it's not just yoga. Sometimes it's hiking, anything where we can get our bodies moving, because we understand that our bodies can hold a lot of that trauma. But the earth is a really good tool for us to kind of bring some of those defensive systems and responses down. It connects us to our bodies, helps us reclaim our bodies again. But when we're moving and sweating and getting it, we can release some of those old wounds. And we found it to be really, really, really empowering for our survivors and our family members. And just to be in a space where people have experienced similar things and they just understand it. And there's sort of this unspoken, community happening where I'm around people who have experienced things. And we found that in those activities that we're doing, it creates a space for people to talk to each other and talk about what they're going through. But we can also share some of the knowledge of our experiences and how we overcame them as well. This is our MMIW healing and response team. So I did share a little bit before. It's a team of about 5 or 6 people right now. Most of us are survivors, family members, but we do have consultants that we work with quite frequently that are experts in the system, whether it's jurisdictional issues or, law enforcement protocols around missing and murdered, and helping us navigate all of those different systems with the family so that the family doesn't have to carry that. So we offer those consultations with our family members if they want to meet with any of them. But we also try to create spaces where the ones working their cases can meet with the families and have conversations with the families as well. Economic empowerment is a big part of what we do for our family members, because there's a lot of needs. When you have a relative who's gone missing and murdered, a lot of times that trauma and that grief is so much. Our families have lost their jobs, or they're not able to work because they're out searching, or, their mental health and physical health really takes a toll. So we want to try and empower them in any way that we can in meeting those, hygiene needs, housing needs, helping them with their young ones that they might be having to care for now, whether it's birthday packages or clothes for school. It's a community approach to wrapping around our families. Media work is a big piece. That's oftentimes put on families to sort of navigate how do we get our story out there so it can get some attention and movement. How do we build, a press release? Who do we contact? We just try to draft those for the families and contact local news, national news when we're able to get that type of attention. But in a lot of cases, what we see is that social media is our main mover for these cases, because it's a platform that's easily accessible and used. And we do, at the root of that, provide healing work. So we try to use whatever way that the family follows and uplift that in any way that we can. So Maria asked if we could touch a little bit on the jurisdictional issues. Yes, I think in all cases, even for survivors or our missing families or families of those who have gone murdered, jurisdiction is a really, really big issue. And that was, again, because of acts of Congress that have passed over time, it sort of stripped away tribal ability to prosecute major crimes. So that's kidnapping, sexually violent crimes, and put that in the hands of federal government. And then there was a sentencing limit. So even the tribal nations that are able to prosecute these crimes and do have courts, they're only able to sentence up to a certain amount. And I think in most cases, it's about 3 years, and then you can stack it up to 3. So possibly 9 years. So for that reason, when it comes to like major crimes, while some tribes may have the ability, because not every tribe has a tribal court, they don't have the resources, or they're a PL 280 tribe. So that means then all of those major crimes and jurisdictions belong to the county that they reside in. Wisconsin is one of those PL 280 states. So every tribal nation within Wisconsin is PL 280, and that response would fall on the county, with the exception of the Menominee Nation. So they're a sovereign nation. And even that is confusing because Menominee is their own county, and the county is the tribal, trust lands. So you have county, tribal, and federal jurisdiction all within one sort of county. And then trying to navigate that and determine that is often, was the victim Native or non-Native? Was the perpetrator Native or non-Native? And where did that crime occur? And you have to navigate all of those questions to figure out who has jurisdiction. So adding on top of that, when you have a county that is PL 280 and responsible for prosecuting these crimes, investigating these crimes, and there isn't a great relationship with tribal nations because of this real settler colonial past, there's bias, there's racism. I mean, when you look at the Northwoods of Wisconsin, if any of you remember the protests that were happening because of spearfishing, there was blatant racism, and it still exists today. It's called, we call it kind of like the deep North, right? The deep Northwoods. It's like this hidden spot of racism. And I think you see that all over. It's not really talked about. And these are the systems that our survivors have to go to for help. These are the systems that our families have to go to for help when they're trying to get justice for the relatives of missing and murdered. So I hope that was answering your question, Maria. And then another thing that we offer our families here is case documentation and GIS mapping of their cases. We found that we can create some system change in documenting systems responses for our family members, and then finding patterns of either re-traumatization, lack of response, but also what worked well. When did we have good responses, and pulling out those patterns. And then we can map them out in a GIS map. So you can see on a physical map, where the violence is occurring, whose jurisdiction it was, whose it should have been. But how can we sort of interrupt these patterns of non-response and biased response? And we try to do as many land for wellness healing retreats as we can. We do about 2 a year where we invite all of our families and survivors. And we have a 2 to 3 day retreat where it's just focused on connecting to each other, connecting to the land, and sort of healing from some of these really traumatic events that they've experienced. So this is an extension of the data work. One of the issues is that we're often invisible in the data as well. So when you look at a lot of data, whether it's about survivors, Indigenous women survivors, or families of MMIW and MMIP, we just don't exist in the data. And that is a really big issue, because if we're invisible in the data, that often means we go overlooked when it comes to allocating resources. So we're trying to prevent that issue, and we're trying to correct that issue through collecting our own data and training our helpers and volunteers that want to be a data warrior, and sort of reclaiming our stories through data and mapping those issues of non-response. And this map here, the green map where you see all the black lines and then the ones in the highlights, that was one of the maps that we actually did to help people see the connection between pipelines and resource extraction and where tribal trust lands are located. And we can probably drop that in the chat too. There's a link, or we can have it emailed out to a story map that we created around this. It gives you an overview of MMIW, some of the response and like the root causes, all the way, from doctrine and discovery to resource extraction and contemporary issues that we're seeing. But this map, the black lines are actually crude oil pipelines, and the highlighted green areas are tribal trust land. So we just wanted to show you like this across, the United States, North America is where all of those pipelines are located. And do you see any patterns of where they are located? So they're often intentionally rerouted through tribal trust lands for permitting reasons. It's a lot easier to get permitting for them to go through those lands than through neighboring, non-tribal trust lands. So how can we as a community interrupt that settler colonial violence against our survivors and families within our systems? And how can we support survivors and family members? I think one of the major asks is really learning about the tribal nations in which you're serving. So how many of us really know and understand all of the tribal nations that are here in Wisconsin, where they're located, who they serve, and know their tribal codes as well, and where are sacred sites, and how do we honor and respect tribal sovereignty? So if you're not familiar with those things, we really encourage you to do some homework in understanding tribal sovereignty here in Wisconsin and across the US, and how that honoring that can really work to prevent violence against Indigenous women. And when we're looking to serve our survivors and serve our family members, to make sure that we're engaging survivors in whatever those solutions might be, that the solutions should be led by our survivors and our family members, and we're just working as supports to uplift them. We can work towards defunding resource extraction and working towards more greener economy. And that includes looking at our own buildings and institutions. How can we make these really small changes within our own building to make sure that we're leaving a really nice green footprint for our future generations. And then we can, provide funding and resources for grassroots who are doing this work. A lot of the prevention work, the healing work, the response work for MMIW and P is being led by families and survivor grassroots. Some are formal organizations like ourselves, and others are just survivors and family members out there responding and doing what they can. In any way that you can, if you have access to media, whether it's internally or externally, we ask that you uplift Indigenous stories, not just of our trauma and pain, but of the successes and the reclamation of healing and empowerment within our communities as well. And that helps with addressing some of that bias and racism, about Indigenous people, and correcting that. And then we also ask that you sort of take a look at your own policy, your own procedures, and your own budgets. And are they really helping Indigenous people, or are they harmful to Indigenous people? Whether that's intentional or not intentional. But I think if you have Indigenous people on your staff, don't put it all on them. But if you don't, please start recruiting Indigenous survivors and advocates and helpers to take a look at, is our institution causing harm? Are we providing access to Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit and families in the way that they need it? And then you have to like be not just an ally in, you know, someone that's walking with us, but you have to really stand up and use your voice to actively speak out against gender-based violence and racism and oppression in any way that you can. And then offer up any of your strengths and resources. You know, we need a lot of help. Our survivors need a lot of help in many different forms. So maybe you're good at media, maybe you're a great storyteller, maybe you have access to, you know, pro bono legal funds. Maybe you're really good at social and economic justice work. Looking at what are your gifts and how can you help them support the people on the ground doing the work. So if you're looking to find a little bit more about the issue of MMIW itself, UIHI has a really extensive report out there that you should all take a look at. And NIWRC is the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. They have all kinds of libraries and, you know, digital media help for you in supporting survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and families of MMIW, MMIP. So if you're looking for policy, if you're looking for training, that's a really good website to have on hand. In addition to working with Indigenous people in your surrounding community. So that's a little bit about some of the work that we do in trying to interrupt some of the violence that we see and help our families and survivors both heal and seek justice. If there's any questions, we'd be willing to take some questions or thoughts or comments about what you heard or saw. And if you need to get a hold of me, here's my email and our website. Oh, and you should see a poll pop up if you could just take a few seconds to fill out the poll. And I should note that like some of the movement here in Wisconsin with MMIW has led to a task force with the Wisconsin DOJ, and they're actually wrapping, we're on that task force. I co-chair the Family Impact Subcommittee. So we're wrapping up our final report and findings around the issues of MMIW here in Wisconsin. And that should be out along with our plans for implementation and recommendations for change here in Wisconsin in December. And at the federal level, there's the Not Invisible Act Commission, which we're also a part of. That work has just started. So we're hoping that we can use the voices of our survivors and family members to make some change, not just within our local community, but at the state and the federal levels. And if you need any trainings, we do offer trainings around how do you build best practices in working with survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence, and also how do you build your own MMIWP healing and response teams within your communities. I don't see any more questions, so I think we might be able to wrap up a little bit early, but thank you everybody for attending. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you take something with you and have a great day.